Welcome to the Scientific Sense podcast, where we explore emerging ideas from science, policy, economics, and technology. My name is Gil Eapen. We talk with world's leading academics and experts about their recent research or general areas of topical interest. Scientific Sense is an unstructured conversation with no agenda or preparation. We cover a wide variety of domains where new discoveries are made and new technologies are developed on a daily basis. We are most interested in how new ideas affect society and help educate the world how to pursue a rewarding and enjoyable life rooted in science, logic, and information. We seek knowledge without boundaries or constraints and provide unedited content of conversations with researchers and leaders who love what they do. A companion blog to this podcast can be found at scientificsense.com, and this podcast is available on over a dozen platforms and directly at scientificsense.net. If you have suggestions for topics, guests, and other ideas, please send them to info@scientificsense.com, and I can be reached at gil@eapen.info. My guest today is Professor Shreya Saxena, who is an assistant professor of electrical and computer engineering at the University of Florida. Her research focuses on the interface of statistical inference, recurrent neural networks, control theory, and neuroscience. Welcome, Shreya.
Thank you so much, Gil, for having me.
Yeah, thanks for doing this. So I want to start with a review article you have from 2019 entitled Towards a Neural Population Doctrine, in which you say across neuroscience, large-scale data recording and population-level analysis methods have experienced explosive growth, while the underlying hardware and computational techniques have been well received. We focus here on the novel science that these technologies have enabled. So this is a topic of great interest for me also, Shreya. So you're sort of looking at the intersection of neuroscience and computer science.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. So the computational mechanisms of how neural activity is encoded and can be decoded into behavior, that's exactly what I consider in this review article as well as in my research.
Yeah, so obviously, as you know, neural networks have been around from the 60s, I believe. And there is a lot more interest in artificial neural networks. More recently, there was some mathematical progress, but more importantly, cheaper computers and more memory have made these things more usable now. But your research is a sort of using artificial neural networks to trace back what might be happening in the brain. Could you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, my research focuses on both the utility of artificial neural networks to help us in just building better models to decode behavior, as well as really trying to figure out what are the parallels between these artificial neural networks and how the brain computes. So these are sort of two almost separate questions, but there are lots of intersections between them, of course.
Yeah. So are there any parallels?
Right. Yeah, that's a good question. So there's a lot of research in the last, especially in the last decade or so, of how we can best understand the decoding and encoding mechanisms in the brain. So, for example, this was kind of jump-started in the visual neuroscience domain, where researchers basically built artificial neural networks to go from images directly to classification of these images, and then post hoc, after training these artificial neural networks, compared the activity to the neural activity that was recorded when a primate, a non-human primate, was doing the same task. So these are the kinds of goal-directed networks that people are considering researchers, including myself, are considering for trying to understand how the brain might be actually performing the same kinds of computations as artificial neural networks. So the same kinds of things, the same kinds of principles we're analyzing in motor neuroscience. So again, using goal-directed networks to go directly from a hypothesized input to, for example, the motor cortex. And then these networks are actually trained on that to go from that hypothesized input to the observed behavior of the subjects. And so these networks then can be, again, compared to the actual neural activity that collaborators record in non-human primates, and we can figure out the parallels in this kind of a way.
Yeah, so you say neural populations are understood to be the essential unit of computation in many brain regions. The artificial neural networks, if you do supervised machine learning type use case, you have labeled cases, you have backpropagation, and you're training the network. Does the brain do anything like that?
Unfortunately, no. That's where sort of the training aspect is a whole other ball game. How to actually implement biologically plausible learning. That's not something I consider in my research yet, but that is a line of research that is actively being pursued.
Okay, so when you say goal-directed neural network, what do you mean?
Right. So here I mean basically that the neural network is trained to do basically the same thing that an experimental subject, is trained to do. So if the subject is classifying images on a screen, then their eyes take in that image, and then somewhere in the brain they are actually able to identify what that image is, and then they push a button, for example, to be able to classify that as either a bus or a car or some kind of an object. So somewhere in the brain, this processing is happening. People actually train neural networks to do exactly that same thing. So go from an image to a classification of that image. So that's kind of the goal of the brain. And so that's why it's kind of called the goal-driven network approach. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so in an experimental setting, you actually have a deep neural network trained to classify, let's say it's a binary classification, two images, and the network can assign a probability which bucket an image goes. And you have a subject, whether it's a human or a monkey or whatever, doing the same thing, and you're trying to figure out what happens in the brain.
Yeah, so the hypothesis is that a network trained to do the same task might actually have representations in the network which are also present in the brain. So that's the post hoc sort of analysis or analysis of similarity between what is learned by the network and what is present, the neural recordings that are present in the brain.
So do you image the brain in such a process to understand where the activity might be? How do you figure out what actually happens?
Yeah, no, exactly. So my research is computational, but I work with experimental collaborators who do these kinds of experiments. So for example, I work with a collaborator in the motor control area, where again, so using these kinds of goal-driven approaches, there's a non-human primate performing an experiment at the same time. Their neural activity from the motor cortex is recorded, as well as their muscle activity from intracortically. So their muscle activity is recorded at the same time. So basically, we can then fit networks or train networks to go to directly produce this muscle activity. So that's the goal in the motor cortex case. So basically, these networks are trained to produce directly the muscle activity, and we then compare the trained networks nodes and the nodes activity to the actual recordings from the motor cortex of the non-human primate.
Yeah, so this is the paper, your recent paper, performance limitations in sensorimotor control, trade-offs between neural computation and accuracy in tracking fast movements. Is that the one
No, actually,
No.
this is the one I'm just was referring to is called motor cortex activity across movement speeds, when it's predicted by network level strategies for generating muscle activity.
Yeah. And so let's talk about that paper. You say learned movements can be skillfully performed at different paces. What neural strategies produce this flexibility, you ask, can they be predicted and understood by network modeling? So some kind of a task that is repeating, right? And biological systems. What are we using here? These are monkeys, right? The experiment is
That's
with
correct.
monkeys. And
Yes.
so looking at how they sort of do this in different speeds, and how an artificial network might do the same thing, right?
Yes, exactly. So here the monkey was trained to produce cycling movements at different speeds. So basically, they had a virtual landscape in front of them, so a screen where their location was changing according to according to how much they cycled using their limb. And so they were actually tracking the target that was moving in this virtual landscape, and the target was moving at different speeds. So the monkey was also producing these movements at different speeds. And the question here was, how do we best understand how the motor cortex can actually produce these movements, produce varied muscle activity at different speeds? And the key here is also to realize that the muscle activity necessarily has to change across different speeds. I mean, think about when you are riding a bicycle and you're just cycling at different speeds. When you speed up, you don't just move faster, you also contract your muscles in different amplitudes. So your muscle activity doesn't just have the same pattern but shorter. It actually changes much very differently in these different speeds.
Yeah. So what are we learning? So you say here network solutions reflected the principle that smooth, well-behaved dynamics require low trajectory tangling and yielded quantitative and qualitative predictions. What do you mean by trajectory tangling?
Yeah, that is a term that has been coined in a previous paper by the same last author as this paper. So the trajectory tangling here refers to a metric to diagnose a system's robustness to noise. So and really how autonomous the system is. So you can think of a system that is being, let's say it's being driven by inputs. So if it's being driven by inputs, it will basically just follow the same follow the same trajectories as what the input directs it to, but it will not have as many recurrent dynamics. So right, and so this metric really just quantifies that intuition, that how much of the dynamics of the network are recurrent and how many are input driven or noise driven.
Yeah, so these are recurrent networks, right? That you're using here.
That's correct. Yes.
And so what are we finding? As you mentioned, it is quite complex to do a task at different speeds. It is not just repeating things. It's almost like a different task when you do things in different speeds, right? So what are we learning from the monkey experiment, how the brain does it?
Yeah, so right, it is quite complicated because it's while the muscle activity does have to change considerably while going at different speeds, there has to be still somewhere in the brain that encodes these different muscle activities in a very in a way that is quite simple at the end of the day, because once you learn a movement at one speed, you have to be able to generalize it to other speeds. You should be able to go as fast as you want to once you have learned that movement. And so there has to be somewhere in the brain that can take that given a speed input, like how fast do you want to go, it has to be able to generate this varied muscle activity. And so we basically trained neural networks to do this exact task, and basically found that the neural networks that are trained to do this task actually resemble quantifiably as well as qualitatively. They resembled the neurons in the motor cortex that were recorded while the same task was going on. And so we think that that the motor cortex and surrounding regions and recurrently connected regions are the ones that are actually responsible for doing this, for making this transformation.
Yeah, so that's very interesting, Shreya. So you say here responses support the hypothesis that the dominant neural signals reflect not muscle activity, but network level strategies for generating muscle activity. So if I understand this correctly, you learn a task, and then once you learn it, you can generalize that task at varying speeds. But both artificial networks as well as the monkeys are able to do that.
Yes, exactly. That's right. So if you learn a task at one speed and then you just want to speed it up, you need somewhere in the brain that can encode for that transformation. And that's exactly what the networks were able to do. And in a very similar way, the neurons are also able to do from the motor cortex.
So, I mean, in the biological system, we can observe how the monkey is doing it. So there has to be signals traveling from the brain to the muscles, and then you have contract the muscle and so on. How do you replicate that in an RNN?
Yeah, the RNN here is right. So it's a recurrent neural network that takes in the speed input and generates the muscle activity. So that's exactly what we hypothesized the motor cortex, the output of the motor cortex is, the varied muscle activity. So that's exactly what we try to replicate using networks.
So the muscle activity, though, when you send some signals to the muscles, it is not quite deterministic, right? There could be noise, there could be some stochastic aspects to it. So how do we do you see that in in an artificial network?
Yeah, so it all depends on how you train it, right? So yes, we do input noise and the network's nodes while we are training, such that it learns a robust solution. So yes, we do have to take that into account while training the networks.
Yeah. You say also neural population trajectories share their organization not with muscle trajectories, but with network solutions. And so essentially all the computations is in that neural population, right? And it's basically sending a signal to the muscles. And at that point, that is fairly mechanistic. There is nothing much happening in that communication.
Right. So one can kind of very nicely see this in experiments where the neural activity at the last stages before it gets transformed into muscle activity is quite deterministic in nature. So there is not as much stochasticity there. But in the neural populations activity themselves, we do see some stochasticity. So that's exactly what we model in the recurrent nodes. But to come back to your question about the dominant signals in the brain and the motor cortex that we see, right? So those are actually, very surprisingly, those are actually not the output signals. So one can imagine that in the motor cortex, if we do train it to reproduce muscle behavior, or if we are recording the muscle behavior at the same time, we might see that the motor cortex neurons are just very much like the single muscle activity. So, one neuron might be quantitatively and qualitatively very similar to, one muscle. But we're not actually seeing that. We're actually seeing that the recurrent nodes and the recurrent activity in the motor cortex is the dominant sort of signal in the motor cortex.
Yeah, so this may have some implications for diseases too, right? Is that something that you have looked into? Parkinson's and things like that.
Right. So So the mechanisms of how this activity is generated and transformed into muscle activity, yes, that has many implications for rehabilitation and also how things go wrong in diseased models. So I looked at that a little bit more in another paper, which from the first one that you were mentioning, performance limitations. Yeah. Right. So there I look actually at spiking neural networks, where we are hypothesizing, we're basically quantifying the effect of neural information transfer and the dynamics of the musculoskeletal system, and quantifying their effect on how fast we can move. So basically, the speeds at which you can move is just basically determined by these factors. And so basically we are quantifying how fast we can move using these building blocks. And here, sorry, I was going to connect it to the disease model.
A little deeper into that, Shreya. So we'll take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll talk about that paper.
Great, thank you.
This is a Scientific Sense podcast providing unscripted conversations with leading academics and researchers on a variety of topics. If you'd like to sponsor this podcast, please reach out to info@scientificsense.com.
So we're back, Shreya. We were talking about the similarities between artificial neural networks and the brain, the neural populations in the brain, and a lot of the work that you have done in this area. Many of them actually indicate, if I understand this correctly, Shreya, correct me if I'm wrong, that artificial neural networks like recurrent neural networks seem to behave reasonably similar to biological systems or brains of monkeys, for example, and how they learn tasks, whether they could do tasks in different speeds and so on. You have another paper just came out, Performance Limitations in Sensorimotor Control, Trade-offs between neural computation and accuracy in tracking fast movements. So here you say the ability to move fast and accurately track moving objects is fundamentally constrained by the biophysics of neurons and dynamics of the muscles involved. Yet the corresponding trade-offs between these factors and tracking motor commands have not been rigorously quantified. That makes a lot of intuitive sense. I guess from an evolutionary perspective, both the predator and the prey required this, right? They had to essentially move fast and change direction and so on. And so this might be something that we picked up very, very early, I would think.
Yeah, that's a good hypothesis. I'll have to defer to evolutionary behavioral researchers to really answer that question. But yes, I mean, basically, in predators and preys all the time. So, for example, take a cheetah chasing a gazelle or a wildebeest. You see the gazelle or wildebeest often making quick side-to-side movements while trying to escape the cheetah, and that's exactly what the cheetah, for example, has a little bit of a hard time doing. So, so yeah, you see this all the time in nature, that there are these fundamental limitations when it comes to tracking fast movements. And that's exactly what we quantify here as a function of the neural system and the musculoskeletal system.
Yeah, so it makes sort of physical sense. When you have fast movements, you have to process it, and then you have to send signals to the muscles. And so, so you say here that we use feedback control principles to quantify performance limitations of the sensorimotor control system, SCS, to track fast periodic movements. So what is a feedback? What is the system that you're talking about?
Right. So, we have to always remember that we are not just working in an open loop. We are actually integrating sensory signals all the time and converting those into action. So the environment is very much in this closed loop while we are especially considering tasks like tracking the signal that is moving. And so that's what we consider here, that we have some kind of sensory information coming back that is being transformed into through the neural system, through the neurons. We are actually transforming our sensory signals into motor commands. And so that's kind of the feedback control that we're modeling here. And so that's taking that into account, we come up with sort of quantifiable bounds on how fast we can actually track a moving object.
And so this is also an artificial neural network that you're creating?
Well, in the broadest of senses, yes, it's a spiking model of how the brain might be transforming these signals. It's not the modern the recurrent neural network architecture, but it's basically a linear dynamical system, so still dynamical in nature, and that's being transformed into spiking activity through biologically based neural models.
Yeah, so I don't know much about this, Shreya, but there has been some interest in the spiking neural networks, right? It seems to sort of model biological systems more closely. So what is the difference there? What do you mean by a spike?
Yeah, spike is what we know of how a neuron transmits information. So if the signal that is coming in from other neurons to one specific neuron is basically to a close approximation integrated, and then once it reaches a threshold, it emits a binary electrical pulse that is then transmitted to the next neuron over. And so this binary 0 or 1 signal that we call a spike. So when it's a 1, the neuron is spiking. When it's a 0, there's no spike.
And you talk about a few observations here. One of them, you say linear models of the SCS fail to predict undesirable phenomena, including skipped cycles, overshoot and undershoot, produced when tracking signals in the fast regime, while nonlinear pulsatile control models can predict such undesirable phenomena. And so if you have a task and you sort of weight the speed of that task, when you reach some speed, I would imagine, we won't be able to keep up, right? We'll skip and we'll have overshoot and undershoot.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. So we see very clearly when we are doing tasks that basically, if we're trying to track a signal, we will be quite good at it until a certain speed is reached. And then after that, we'll start seeing these kinds of undesirable phenomena. So we'll start skipping cycles. We will start really creating a lot of errors, very specific kinds of errors. And so that's exactly the phenomena that we're trying to quantify using spiking networks of neural activity.
Yeah, so mechanistically, what happens there, Shreya? So is there some sort of a feedback that needs to go back and so suppose I take an action, the brain needs to know that action has been taken, right? So there's some, I guess, there could be some latency in that. Is that sort of the limit here? Is that the issue?
Right. So yeah, no, and there are latencies everywhere. So including your sort of how fast the latency to actually visualize where you are and where the goal is. So there's a latency involved there. There's a latency involved in the neural activity itself as it transmits the information. And then finally, there's a latency by the muscles to actually really create that action. So we model in the dynamics, different parts of this, and it's basically it's basically a phenomenon that happens due to all the different parts. We have to take into account all of them, and that's really how we get to this kind of a limit of how fast we can go.
Yeah, I know that you're not doing research in this area, but it'll be very interesting to see. I guess the data is tough to get, but any sort of longitudinal data that clearly the prey or the predator would have had some advantages if they could continue to reduce that latency and continue to go faster, right? So I wondered over time if animals gotten better at this.
Yeah, that's a great question. I would hypothesize that they have, and we see this in sports all the time. When we look at Olympics, for example, the kinds of feats that we can do are just getting better and better, which is, I know, different from the predator-prey model, but it kind of gives us an idea of how we are getting better over time and over generations. So yeah, I would argue that that's definitely a very interesting thing to examine. The other thing I wanted to sort of, coming back to your previous question about modeling and analyzing diseased activity using these kinds of models. So just to sort of give a background, I mean, when, in Parkinson's disease, or people have a stroke, for example, their movements are affected to a large degree, and the prevailing thing that we see actually in their movements is that their movements are slower. So in Parkinson's, there might be tremors as well, but on top of that, their movements are generally very much slower. And so to be able to restore movement speeds, we can actually use models such as these in order to design compensators, for example, at either the musculoskeletal level or the neural level, in order to help people go faster.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So, like you mentioned, in a stroke or progressive Parkinson's disease, all the issues are in the neurons, right? It is sort of the firing of the neurons that got affected.
Exactly. So here, by modeling it as a system, as a closed loop system, we're taking into account the neural activity and how these diseases actually affect the neural activity. And but however, because it's a system, we can think about, even if the neural activity is affected, we can try to design compensators at the musculoskeletal level in order to reach the similar movement speeds that would have happened without the neural diseases.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So if you can predict, you said the signals are somewhat slower. So if you can systematically predict that, like you say, you can then compensate at the muscular level somehow, right? To take out.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. Has that been done?
I mean, we are examining this, as well as collaborators are also examining this exact question. So stay tuned.
Yeah, that's really exciting. You say here also, Shreya, that we derive an analytical upper bound on frequencies that SES model can reliably track before producing such undesirable phenomena that we talked about, such as skipping. So an analytical upper bound. So is it a bit like when you hit that frequency, things start to break. Till then, things are okay. So it's a sort of a binary breakpoint.
Exactly. Yes, exactly.
And so this again goes back to what you were talking about, the latency in different parts of the system, and it can only handle some frequency. But it's kind of interesting, though, given the complexity of the system, that you can actually derive sort of a binary breakpoint. Is there more to that idea?
Yeah, I mean, so behaviorally, we do see this kind of binary breakpoint. When we are looking at how, for example, if I just tell you to track a signal that is moving periodically, you will reach a frequency after which you just cannot do it. So it's usually quite binary, until that frequency things are going mostly okay, and after that you start skipping cycles, you start displaying these undesirable phenomena. And so that's exactly what we're trying to model in using these kinds of models. And so yes, we make approximations when modeling. Of course, the system is way too complicated to model completely mechanistically, but using these kinds of approximations, we can still identify these kinds of breakpoints as well. That's exactly what we model.
Yeah, I was also thinking, Shreya, I don't know if it's possible, there might be some diagnostic capabilities here too, right? So if you have progressive Parkinson's disease, if you can pick it up early through, some sort of observations, then perhaps you can intervene early or slow down the progression. Or if you have strokes, for example, minor strokes that lead to movement issues. Do you see some diagnostic type capabilities that you could build?
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, I think that sounds exactly sort of, before the person might be even able to tell that there's something wrong, we might be able to exactly apply these kinds of tests and try to get at that question.
Yeah, that'll be really exciting. So in conclusion, Shreya, I know that your lab is doing a lot of work in this area. So if you look forward 5-10 years, where do you think we are most likely to make a huge impact? This was really interesting to me because I would have thought the artificial neural networks won't get anywhere close to how the brain actually sends the signals, but that is not what you're finding. So where do you think you will take it in the next 5-10 years?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, so as you mentioned near the beginning of this interview, we really see the capabilities of artificial neural networks increasing over time, and that's really helpful in order to analyze, to understand neural activity and how it might be computing and how our brains might be computing. But I think one important thing to keep in mind over the next, many years is also that it's in tandem with a dynamical body. We have to kind of bring in the body dynamics when modeling, when trying to understand the brain. It's our limbs are the interface between the brain and the actual world. So modeling that very concretely, I think, will be really helpful to understand not just the limitations of the brain, but how do we actually move forward in rehabilitation, as well as understanding of how the neurons are computing. And this can also then have many interfaces with robotics. How can we better design these machines in order to perform the same way that we do?
Yeah, a lot of companies seem to be making a lot of developments in the area of robotics now. And so, like you say, this boundary, there's a lot of work in sort of understanding the neuroscience aspects of the brain and the mechanics of the body. Sometimes it's a little bit separate from it, right? And what you're saying.
Yes, exactly. It's overlooked a lot of the times, but I think it's very important to be able to understand the neural systems.
Yeah. Excellent. Yeah, this has been great, Shreya. Thanks so much for spending time with me.
Oh, thank you so much for the invitation. It was really great to talk to you.
Thank you.
This is a Scientific Sense podcast providing unscripted conversations with leading academics and researchers on a variety of topics. If you'd like to sponsor this podcast, please reach out to info@scientificsense.com.